The Mediterranean Sea stretched endlessly before them, its shimmering waters reflecting the golden rays of the sun as the luxury yacht cut through the waves like a knife. On board, the atmosphere was one of quiet elegance, sparkling champagne glasses, crisp linen, and laughter filling the air. Barack and Michelle Obama had been invited to this exclusive event to celebrate global leaders and visionaries. It was meant to be a moment of relaxation, an opportunity to reconnect after the demands of their public lives. But what seemed like a flawless retreat was soon to take a dark turn, one that neither of them could have foreseen. As they boarded the vessel, the air felt thick with something unspoken. The crew, dressed in pristine uniforms, greeted them with polished smiles, but there was an unmistakable chill in their eyes. They moved with a sense of purpose, but their actions lacked warmth, their gestures mechanical. Barack and Michelle exchanged a glance, sensing that something wasn't quite right, but choosing to dismiss it. They had faced far worse in their lives, nothing would spoil this moment, or so they thought. The Captain, Richard Davenport, a man with an imposing presence and a steely gaze, was the first to welcome them aboard. His handshake was firm, but his eyes never quite met theirs. A subtle yet telling gesture that sent a faint ripple of unease through Michelle. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform impeccably pressed. But there was something about him, something in his demeanor, that felt off. He gave his introduction with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, his words smooth but hollow. "It's an honor to have you aboard, Mr. and Mrs. Obama," he said, his voice oozing with formality. Barack nodded politely, offering his own handshake. "Thank you, Captain Davenport. We're looking forward to this." Michelle, ever the perceptive one, noticed the brief but deliberate hesitation as Davenport shook her hand. The grip was too tight, almost possessive. And the glint in his eyes lingered just a second too long. She couldn't put her finger on it yet, but there was something about him that felt wrong. She smiled, masking the growing discomfort. And they followed him inside, ready to enjoy what was meant to be a luxurious cruise. The yacht was an opulent display of wealth, its interior bathed in soft light from the grand chandeliers hanging overhead. The grand dining room featured polished marble floors, and the smell of fresh flowers lingered in the air. Guests were seated at large tables covered in fine linens, their conversations low and intimate. But despite the lavish surroundings, the Obamas couldn't shake the strange sense of distance they felt from the rest of the passengers. As the yacht began its slow journey across the sea, Michelle found herself staring out at the horizon, her mind drifting. Barack sat next to her, his eyes scanning the guests. They were surrounded by high-profile individuals, wealthy elites, and influential figures from across the globe, people who spoke of business deals and international policies, but something about the atmosphere felt oppressive. The small talk felt forced, the laughter hollow. It wasn't long before the first cracks began to show. Captain Davenport reappeared after a few minutes, his expression now colder. He greeted the guests with a sense of superiority, making it clear that he was in charge. His conversations with the other passengers were laced with subtle jabs at anyone he deemed beneath him. Barack couldn't help but notice the way Davenport spoke about certain countries, dismissing entire nations with casual disdain. "Some people just don't know how to build a successful economy," he sneered, his words sharp and cruel. It was clear that he didn't care for the less fortunate, the marginalized. And it was hard to ignore the way he looked at Barack, a look that wasn't just condescending, but deeply antagonistic. "Seems like he has quite the opinion on things," Barack remarked quietly to Michelle, trying to keep the conversation light. Michelle didn't respond immediately. She was watching Davenport closely, noting the way he interacted with others. There was a thinly veiled arrogance in his tone, an air of superiority that reminded her of the subtle forms of prejudice they had encountered throughout their lives. It wasn't outright racism, but it was there, lurking beneath the surface. As much as she tried to ignore it, she couldn't help but feel the weight of his disdain. Especially when his eyes flicked toward her with what could only be described as contempt. The evening progressed, and the guests gathered for dinner. The ambience was luxurious, with waitstaff moving swiftly to serve exquisite dishes. The food was impeccable, but the tension in the air was palpable. Conversations were becoming strained, especially between Davenport and the Obamas. His casual remarks, laced with veiled insults, had begun to escalate. The moment Barack mentioned his background and the work he had done in the White House, Davenport's smile grew colder. "You know, Mr. Obama," Davenport began, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "It's always amusing how someone with your background can reach such heights. Politics really is a game, isn't it?" Barack's jaw tightened, but he remained composed. He had learned over the years how to keep his temper in check, how to navigate situations like these with grace. "It's all about opportunity," he replied, his tone neutral, though his eyes were sharp. "The right opportunities, the right people, sometimes, that's all it takes." Michelle's gaze hardened. She had been quiet up until now, but the subtle jabs were becoming harder to ignore. It wasn't just about their past achievements, it was about something deeper, something personal. Davenport wasn't just challenging their careers, he was challenging their very existence. And his words were beginning to grate on Michelle's nerves. "Some people are born to lead, others are born to follow," Davenport continued, his voice growing more condescending. He took a sip from his glass of wine, his eyes gleaming as if daring them to challenge him. Michelle could feel the heat rising in her chest. She opened her mouth, ready to respond. But Barack placed a hand on her arm, his touch gentle but firm. He knew the situation was getting tense, but he didn't want to escalate things further. "Not yet, Captain," Barack said. His voice calm but unwavering, "We appreciate your hospitality, but I think it's time we retire for the evening." They excused themselves from the table, walking slowly towards their private quarters. Michelle could feel the weight of Davenport's eyes on her back, but she refused to acknowledge it. As soon as the door to their room closed, the facade of composure shattered. "That man," Michelle began, her voice trembling with frustration. "He's insufferable." Barack sighed, rubbing his forehead. "I know. But we can't let him get to us, Michelle. We're here for a reason." "Barack, that wasn't just a few rude remarks. That was deliberate, hostile, and it's not the first time he's done this. I saw the way he looked at me. This isn't just about us, it's about something much deeper." Barack paused, considering her words. The truth was, he had felt it too, the subtle but unmistakable racism. The air of superiority that hung around Davenport like a dark cloud. But he had learned long ago to pick his battles. He had faced far worse in the political arena. And he knew that the most powerful thing he could do was to remain calm, to rise above it. But this time, something inside him stirred, a sense of injustice that he couldn't ignore. They weren't just dealing with a disrespectful captain, they were dealing with something much more dangerous, something insidious that could not be allowed to go unchecked. "Michelle," Barack began, his voice low but filled with resolve. "We're not leaving this yacht until we find out exactly who we're dealing with. And we're going to expose the truth, no matter what it takes." Michelle nodded, her eyes burning with the same fire that had driven her throughout her life. "You're right. Let's do this." As the yacht sliced through the calm waters of the Mediterranean, the night grew darker. But the air was thick with an ever-increasing unease. Barack and Michelle Obama were no strangers to hostility, they had faced it countless times throughout their careers, but nothing could have prepared them for the palpable tension aboard this luxury yacht, where power and privilege seemed to ooze from every corner. The following day, as the sun rose, the yacht continued its journey across the azure waters. The captain, Richard Davenport, had made his move earlier that morning, subtly undermining Michelle's presence during breakfast by directing all his conversations and attention towards Barack, as if she wasn't even there. The moment had felt like an outright dismissal, but Michelle, ever the composed force, had stayed silent. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. But the weight of his arrogance was beginning to take its toll. As the day progressed, the Obamas tried to maintain their composure, keeping their distance from the crew. They spent most of their time on the deck, staring out at the vast expanse of the sea, trying to find some peace amidst the rising storm within. But despite their best efforts, Davenport's behavior only escalated. Every encounter, every interaction with the crew, seemed laced with condescension. It wasn't just the words, it was the way he moved, the way he glared at them. As if their very presence on the yacht was an affront to his world. It all came to a head during the mid-afternoon gathering. When Davenport made his way over to where Barack and Michelle were sitting, exchanging pleasantries with a few of the other guests. He stood over them like a towering figure. His expression a mixture of disdain and smug superiority. The rest of the guests seemed oblivious, caught up in their own conversations and glasses of champagne. But Barack and Michelle felt the air shift as Davenport loomed over them. "Mr. Obama," Davenport said, his voice dripping with false courtesy, "it's truly remarkable how far you've come, though. Of course, some of us always knew you had potential." Barack met his gaze, a flicker of tension running through his body. He knew exactly what Davenport was doing. He was toying with him, trying to provoke him into a reaction. But Barack had learned long ago that responding to provocations from men like Davenport would only play into their hands. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, a quiet smile playing on his lips. "It's all about opportunity," Barack replied smoothly, his voice calm, and making the most of it. Davenport smirked, clearly not satisfied with the response. "Opportunity, yes. Though it does make one wonder just how much luck plays a role in those opportunities." His eyes flicked briefly to Michelle, then back to Barack. "I suppose not everyone is afforded the same kind of luck, is that right, Mrs. Obama?" The words hit Michelle like a slap across the face. The casual dismissal, the sneering tone, it was unmistakable. She stood up slowly, her eyes flashing with indignation. "Excuse me, Captain, but if you think for a second that you're in any position to judge us, or anyone, for that matter, then you're sorely mistaken." Barack's hand instinctively reached out to stop her, but Michelle was already stepping forward. Her voice steady but laced with a force she rarely revealed. "We don't need your permission to be here. And we certainly don't need your approval to be who we are." For a moment, the room went still. The other guests exchanged nervous glances, unsure how to respond. The crew, always watchful but never quite involved, avoided eye contact as though they were mere bystanders in a drama they could neither understand nor control. Davenport's smile faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered, his mask of superiority slipping back into place. "I see," he said, his voice cold, "so you've decided to take offense at a mere comment." He glanced at his watch, then back at Michelle, as if dismissing her completely. "Perhaps I've misjudged the mood. Please, forgive me." But his apology was insincere, almost mocking. Michelle's chest tightened, and her fists clenched. But she forced herself to remain composed. She turned her back to him, signaling to Barack that it was time to move on. Barack rose to his feet, his posture calm but firm. "We'll be in our quarters," he said evenly. "Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, Captain." In the privacy of their room, the tension that had built up over the course of the day finally exploded. The door clicked shut behind them, and Michelle turned to face Barack, her face flushed with frustration. "Did you see the way he looked at me?" she demanded, her voice shaking with barely contained anger. "Did you hear what he said? He thinks we don't belong here, Barack. And he's making it obvious." Barack exhaled deeply, leaning against the edge of the table. He understood her frustration, more than she could imagine. He had felt it too, the underlying hatred, the dismissive glances, the not-so-veiled insults. But he knew that reacting impulsively wouldn't accomplish anything. The Obamas had faced far worse. There was nothing new about this kind of prejudice. They had survived it before, and they would survive it again. But this time, something was different. "This isn't just about him," Barack said slowly, his voice measured. "This is about something bigger. Something deeper." Michelle looked at him, her eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" Barack hesitated, his mind racing as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. He had sensed it earlier, the strange interactions, the subtle undercurrents of animosity, and now, with the captain's behavior becoming increasingly hostile, it was clear. This wasn't just a case of personal prejudice. There was something more at play. "I think we're dealing with something much darker than simple racism," Barack said, his voice low. "This yacht? It's not just a luxury cruise. It's a front for something. Something criminal." Michelle stared at him, her heart racing. "What are you saying?" "Corruption," he said quietly. "I think Davenport is part of a larger network, a web of corruption that goes far beyond him. And I don't think it's a coincidence that we're here. We've been targeted." Michelle's mind raced. This was no longer just about a few snide remarks from a racist captain. There was a sinister, underlying truth to this situation, one that could shatter everything they thought they knew about the world they lived in. "We need to find out who we're dealing with," Michelle said. Her voice steady, determined. "We can't let them get away with this." Barack nodded. "We won't. We'll expose the truth, no matter what it takes." The tension between the Obamas and Captain Davenport had now reached a boiling point. The game had changed. What had begun as a luxury cruise had now become a battle for survival, for justice, and for the truth. The Obamas were no longer just fighting against racial prejudice, they were fighting a powerful, hidden system of corruption that had the potential to destroy them if they weren't careful. And the stakes had never been higher. The tension aboard the yacht had reached a new level. And every moment spent on the ship felt like a countdown. Barack and Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, their every move scrutinized. There were whispers among the crew. Subtle but growing. At first, it had been a matter of isolated incidents, small barbs and condescending remarks from Captain Davenport. But now, there was an air of suspicion that pervaded the entire ship, a silent understanding that something was off. Everyone knew something, but no one was willing to speak up. The Obamas, determined to uncover the truth, began their own quiet investigation. They knew they couldn't trust the crew, and certainly not Davenport. Their first course of action was to find out exactly who was financing this yacht, who owned it, and who else was involved in this web of deceit. With the ship already thousands of miles from shore, they realized they had limited time to act before things escalated further. Barack had always prided himself on his ability to read people, to sense when something didn't add up. And over the last few days, something had felt incredibly off. He had spent hours poring over his conversations with Davenport, piecing together the captain's words and mannerisms. There was a strange sense of familiarity in how the captain spoke, almost as if he had been trained to handle powerful guests. But it wasn't just his attitude that unsettled Barack. It was the way Davenport seemed to be pulling strings from the shadows, orchestrating interactions between the crew and guests, controlling the narrative without anyone realizing. Michelle, on the other hand, focused on the crew itself. She knew they weren't just pawns in this situation, they were likely complicit in some way, whether out of fear or ambition. It was during one of their routine conversations with the staff that she had overheard something chilling. Two of the crew members, speaking in hushed tones, mentioned a deal. It wasn't clear what the deal was about, but it was enough to spark her suspicion. That night, as the yacht sailed under a moonlit sky, Michelle and Barack met in their quarters. Their minds racing with the pieces of the puzzle they had gathered so far. They had to act quickly before they were cornered, before the darkness that surrounded them consumed everything in its path. "We need to get to the bottom of this," Michelle said, her voice firm with determination. "The crew's involvement is deeper than we thought. We're not just dealing with a racist captain. There's something much larger going on here." Barack nodded, his expression serious. "It's like they've been waiting for us to step into this trap. We're not just here for a vacation. This was planned. But the question is, why us?" Michelle's mind raced. There had to be a reason they had been specifically chosen for this luxury cruise. What could they possibly have that Davenport, or the shadowy figures controlling him, wanted? "The deal I overheard," Michelle continued, her brow furrowing. "It's about us. They've been tracking us, watching our every move." Barack's eyes widened. This isn't just about a few rude comments anymore. This is deliberate. We need to find a way to get to the control room, Michelle said, her voice calm but resolute. We need to get access to the ship's logs, anything that can give us answers. The idea of infiltrating the control room was risky, but Barack knew they had little choice. There were too many unanswered questions. Too many strange things that didn't make sense. Let's move tonight, he said, his tone decisive. We have to act fast before they realize what we're doing. Under the cover of night, the Obamas made their way down the darkened hallways of the yacht. They were both dressed in black, their footsteps muffled against the polished floors. The yacht was eerily quiet, too quiet. The usual sounds of laughter and chatter from the upper decks had faded into an oppressive silence. The crew had likely been instructed to stay out of their way. But the danger of being caught loomed over them. They reached the control room at the bow of the ship, the heart of the yacht's operations. Barack glanced around, making sure the hallway was clear. He knew the risks they were taking. If they were caught snooping around here, there would be no telling how far Davenport or his associates would go to protect their secrets. Michelle carefully checked the door, finding it surprisingly unlocked. She pushed it open gently, her breath catching in her throat as she stepped inside. The room was filled with blinking lights and high-tech equipment, all focused on monitoring the ship's systems. But it wasn't just the ship's mechanics that intrigued her, it was the data, the logs. The records of the ship's movements. Barack quickly moved to the terminal, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he searched for any kind of clue. The files were encrypted. But Barack had a knack for breaking codes. His mind was sharp, always had been. And tonight, it was sharper than ever. He bypassed the first layer of security and then the second. Finally gaining access to the ship's internal communications. His eyes scanned the messages, his pulse quickening as he uncovered something that made his blood run cold. There were multiple records of communications with a group he recognized, an organization known for its ties to corruption, manipulation, and illegal activities. They were the ones funding this yacht trip, using it as a cover for something far more sinister. This is it, Barack whispered, his voice trembling with both shock and anger. They've been using this yacht to smuggle, no, not just smuggle, but to launder money and conduct illicit deals. And we were part of their plan all along. Michelle moved closer, reading over his shoulder. This is bigger than we imagined. These aren't just corrupt individuals, they're connected to some of the highest levels of power. Barack's eyes narrowed as he scanned the last few lines of the communication. They've been following our movements for months. They're using our presence here as leverage. We were never supposed to make it off this ship. Michelle's heart skipped a beat. So this is it. They plan to. Barack didn't need to finish the sentence. The implication was clear. They were in grave danger, and it was no longer just about a fight for justice. It was a fight for their lives. We need to expose this, Michelle said, her voice a low whisper. Before it's too late. Barack nodded, closing the files and quickly wiping any trace of their presence on the computer. We need to make contact with the authorities. But we have to be careful. If we alert the wrong people, we'll never make it off this ship. As they made their way back to their quarters, the weight of what they had uncovered settled heavily on their shoulders. The world they had once known, the world of politics, of influence, now seemed like a distant memory. This was a fight on a different level, one where power was wielded in the shadows. And only those with the strength to uncover the truth would survive. Barack and Michelle knew what they had to do. The battle had just begun, and it was going to be a long, hard fight. But they would not back down. Not now. Not ever. The night felt suffocating as Barack and Michelle returned to their quarters, their minds racing. What they had uncovered in the control room was beyond anything they could have imagined. The yacht, seemingly a luxury cruise for the elite, was nothing more than a front for a much darker operation. They were caught in a trap, a web of corruption, deceit, and danger that stretched far beyond the captain's racist behavior. As they sat in their cabin, strategizing, the weight of the situation sank in. They had to act quickly, But the question was, how? Exposing this operation would be nearly impossible without risking their own lives. The corrupt network behind the yacht wasn't just powerful, it was ruthless. They controlled too many moving parts, and any misstep could cost them everything. We need to find a way to get the evidence to the outside world, Barack said, his voice calm but filled with an undercurrent of urgency. But we can't use any of the usual methods. If we make one wrong move, we could be exposed. Michelle, ever the strategist, nodded. We'll have to rely on our instincts, Barack. We're not just fighting for the truth now, we're fighting to survive. The first step was to gather allies. But the crew members who might have helped them were too scared to speak out. The ones who knew something, who had seen the undercurrents of corruption, had been silenced. Some had been threatened, others bought off. Michelle's heart ached as she thought about how many lives had been crushed under the weight of this operation. But there was one person who had stood out among the rest, Elena. A young crew member who had seemed different from the others. She was quiet, observant, and always seemed to be in the right place at the right time. Michelle had overheard her speaking with one of the guests, someone who had expressed dissatisfaction with the yacht services, only to find Elena calmly and quietly offering solutions. It was clear she wasn't part of the corrupt system, but the question was whether she was willing to take a stand. We need to find Elena, Michelle said, determination in her voice. If she's willing to help, we could have a chance. Barack agreed. Let's find her. It's our only shot. The search for Elena wasn't easy. She had been avoiding them since they started digging into the ship's secrets. Michelle and Barack had to be careful, keeping their movements subtle and blending in with the rest of the guests and crew. They couldn't afford to attract attention. After hours of searching, they finally found Elena in a small crew quarters near the kitchen. She looked up when they entered, her eyes wide with a mix of surprise and fear. But when she saw who it was, her expression softened, and she quickly ushered them inside. I've been waiting for you, Elena whispered, her voice trembling. I knew you weren't here just for a vacation. I've heard the rumors. There's something wrong with this yacht. I know about the deal. But I don't know if I can help you. Barack stepped forward, his voice calm but persuasive. Elena, we need your help. What's happening here goes far beyond just money. There's a network of corruption that's been operating under our noses, and they've targeted us. We need to expose them. But we can't do it without you. We can't do it alone. Elena hesitated, her eyes darting nervously toward the door. I've heard the whispers too. But they've made it clear that if anyone tries to stand in their way, they'll pay the price. People have disappeared, gone without a trace. And I'm not just talking about crew members. Guests, too. People who knew too much. I don't want to end up like them. Michelle placed a hand on Elena's shoulder, her tone gentle but firm. We're not asking you to do this alone. We're in this together. But if we don't act now, no one will ever know the truth. This is bigger than us, bigger than any of us could have imagined. Elena looked down, clearly struggling with the decision. She had worked on the yacht for years, and the idea of turning against the very people who had been feeding her seemed unthinkable. But deep down, she knew she couldn't ignore what was happening. Not anymore. I'll help you, Elena finally said, her voice steady. But we have to move fast. There's a scheduled transfer tomorrow night. It's the perfect time to get everything to the authorities. We'll have one shot, and we have to make it count. Barack and Michelle exchanged a glance. This was it. This was their moment. The plan was simple, but fraught with risks. Elena would gather the necessary evidence, taking it from the ship's archives and making copies of the most damning documents. Meanwhile, Barack and Michelle would prepare for the transfer, ensuring that they would be in the right position to expose the operation as soon as they had the proof. As the hours ticked down to the transfer, the tension aboard the yacht grew. Davenport and his cronies were unaware that their plans were about to be derailed. They had no idea that two of their most high-profile guests had uncovered their dark secrets, and that they were planning to expose them. The night of the transfer arrived. The yacht was docked at a remote location, far from any major ports. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the ship as the crew moved to load cargo onto a waiting vessel. No one suspected that the most important cargo wasn't on the deck. It was hidden in the hands of two determined individuals and an ally who was willing to risk everything. Elena passed the files to Barack and Michelle in a small, dimly lit storage room, her eyes filled with fear and anticipation. The evidence was packed into a secure case, sealed tight to avoid detection. But there was no time to celebrate. They had to get off the yacht without drawing attention. Barack and Michelle moved swiftly through the ship, their hearts pounding in their chests. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of a passing crew member felt like it could be their last. They reached the lower decks where a small boat was waiting for them. Elena had arranged for it to be ready, and the moment they stepped onto the boat, they would be safe. But as they made their way toward the exit, disaster struck. A shadow moved from the corner of their vision, and before they could react, a crew member grabbed Barack by the arm, pulling him into a chokehold. "You thought you could expose us," the crew member sneered, his voice cold and filled with malice. "You should have stayed out of this," Michelle screamed, trying to break free, but two more crew members emerged from the shadows, surrounding them. The fight for their lives had just begun. As the confrontation escalates, Barack and Michelle realize they are running out of time. The corruption they've uncovered is vast, and their only hope is to make it to safety with the evidence they've gathered. But with enemies closing in and danger lurking around every corner, they must rely on each other, and their own wits, to escape the yacht alive. The sound of Michelle's scream echoed through the narrow corridor, breaking the tense silence that had fallen over the yacht. Barack fought back with all his strength. But the crew member's grip was unyielding, the chokehold tightening as the seconds ticked by. Michelle struggled, her eyes wide with fear, but she couldn't break free. The odds were stacked against them, and it seemed like their fight for survival was slipping away. The air was thick with tension. The dimly lit hallway felt like a trap, closing in around them. The three crew members, silent and menacing, had them cornered. The evidence, their one hope for exposing the corruption, was in the hands of a corrupt crew, and it seemed like all was lost. But Barack, ever the strategist, didn't give up. His mind raced as he assessed the situation, looking for any opportunity to escape. In a split second, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small concealed device, something he had managed to slip past the crew earlier. "Michelle, get ready," Barack called, his voice low but filled with determination. In the blink of an eye, he activated the device. A loud alarm blared, filling the ship with a shrill, disorienting noise. The crew members froze for a moment, confused, and that was all Barack needed. With a powerful twist of his body, he broke free from the crew member's grasp. He slammed an elbow into the chest of the second attacker, knocking him backward. Michelle, quick to react, kicked the third crew member in the shin and shoved him away. They were back on their feet now, together, fighting as one. "We don't have much time," Michelle shouted, her voice firm, her eyes burning with resolve. "Get to the boat, now." Barack nodded, and they both bolted for the exit, their footsteps echoing in the hall. The crew members were recovering, but the chaos caused by the alarm had momentarily thrown them off. They knew the only way to survive was to make it to the boat, the only escape route. As they ran through the winding corridors, the yacht's layout became a blur. They didn't know how much time they had left before their attackers regrouped, but one thing was clear, they had to move fast. The case containing the evidence was heavy in Barack's hands. But he held it tightly, unwilling to let go of the chance to bring the truth to light. They reached the lower decks, the cold air from the open hatch cutting through the tension. But just as they were about to board the small boat that had been waiting for them, they heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind them. It was the captain, Davenport. "You thought you could escape this easily?" Davenport's voice was cold and menacing, filled with a chilling authority. "You've uncovered things you shouldn't have. Now, you'll pay the price." Barack and Michelle turned to face him, the captain standing tall in the shadows. His eyes were filled with a twisted sense of control, and his smile was a reminder of the power he wielded. "We're not afraid of you," Barack said, his voice steady but defiant. "We're exposing everything. No matter what happens, the truth will come out." Davenport chuckled darkly. "You have no idea what you're up against. You think you can take down a system that has been in place for years? You're just two guests on a yacht. You have nothing." But Barack and Michelle weren't backing down. They had come too far to turn back now. The sound of footsteps approaching from behind signaled more crew members closing in on them. They were trapped again, with nowhere to run. Michelle quickly glanced at Barack, and he understood. They had one last chance to survive, and they had to make it count. "Elena!" Michelle shouted, her voice desperate. From the shadows, Elena emerged, holding a small gun. She had been the one who triggered the alarm, and now she was their last hope. "Get in the boat," Elena commanded, her voice steady and unwavering. "I'll hold them off." Barack and Michelle didn't hesitate. They sprinted to the boat, their hearts racing. As they jumped in, Elena fired a warning shot into the air, causing Davenport and his crew to hesitate. But it was just enough time. "Go!" Elena shouted, her eyes fierce. "Get out of here!" Barack and Michelle didn't need another word. The boat's motor roared to life as they sped away from the yacht, the waves crashing against the hull. But the danger wasn't over. They could still hear the sound of yelling from the yacht, the crew scrambling to regain control of the situation. As they sailed into the dark night, the truth was finally in their grasp. The evidence was secure, and they were free, for now. But they knew the fight was far from over. The corruption they had uncovered was far-reaching, and the powerful people behind it wouldn't stop until they were silenced. Michelle sat at the front of the boat, her eyes scanning the horizon. The night felt endless, but there was a sense of determination in her. She wouldn't rest until the truth was revealed to the world. Barack turned to her, a look of resolve in his eyes. "This is just the beginning." The next few weeks were a blur. Barack and Michelle, along with Elena, worked tirelessly to get the evidence into the hands of the authorities. They reached out to investigative journalists, law enforcement, and anyone who would listen. The truth about the yacht's operations, the corruption, the human trafficking, and the ruthless exploitation of guests and crew members was slowly but surely revealed to the public. The fallout was swift and brutal. Davenport was arrested, along with several high-ranking members of the crew. Investigations into the yacht's operations led to a wider inquiry into the networks of corruption that spanned across multiple industries. The scandal rocked the elite circles, shattering the illusion of invincibility that had protected the perpetrators for so long. But despite the victories, Barack and Michelle knew the fight was far from over. They had exposed one part of the corruption, but the system that had allowed it to thrive was still intact. There would always be more work to be done, more battles to fight. As they watched the sun rise over the horizon, they knew that the world was forever changed because of their actions. They had not just survived, they had made sure that the truth would never be buried again.